There's a pyramid at Giza that every tourist photograph gets wrong, because every one of those photos is aimed the wrong direction. Up in March of 2025, a team of scientists pointed satellites straight down through half a mile of solid rock underneath the second pyramid at Giza and said they found something nobody expected. Vertical shafts. Cube-shaped chambers the size of stadiums. A buried structure with no obvious explanation. Within 72 hours, one of the most powerful men in Egyptology stood up and called the whole thing fake. Both things are true at once, and by the end of this video you'll understand exactly why what the scans actually claimed, why the pushback was so fast and so brutal, and why, underneath all the noise, the ground at Giza keeps turning out to be stranger than anyone official wants to admit. Subscribe before we go down, because this is the kind of story that gets buried on purpose, twice over. Start with the object itself, because it's real, and it has a name. This is the Pyramid of Khafre, the second largest of the three Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau. Built for the pharaoh Khafre around 2558 to 2532 BC, roughly 4,500 years old, standing about 136 meters tall. For most of modern history, the assumption was simple. A king died, a mountain of stone went up over his body, end of story. But there's always been a wrinkle in that story. Khafre's burial chamber, the one you can actually walk into today, is oddly plain. The sarcophagus was found open. No treasure, no body, no walls covered in inscriptions the way later royal tombs are. For a monument that took a national workforce decades to build, the inside is strangely empty. Almost as if the room we were meant to find was never the point. And Khafre has resisted scanning before. In 1968, Nobel-winning physicist Luis Alvarez brought cosmic ray equipment to Giza specifically to look for hidden chambers inside this pyramid using muon detection, essentially an X-ray made of subatomic particles instead of light. He had the best equipment available at the time. He found nothing. For decades, that silence was treated as proof there was nothing left to find. But absence of a signal isn't the same as absence of structure sometimes. It just means your tools aren't sensitive enough yet. The pyramid kept whatever it was hiding for another 57 years. Which brings us to March 2025. A team led by Corrado Malanga of the University of Pisa, radar engineer Filippo Biondi of the University of Strathclyde, and explorer Armando May held a press conference laying out results from a technique they call synthetic aperture radar Doppler tomography. Synthetic aperture radar itself isn't new. It's used routinely from orbit to map terrain and locate resources underground. What this team says they added is a Doppler layer, as radar passes overhead. Tiny natural vibrations in the rock cause minuscule shifts in the returning signal, and collecting enough of those shifts from enough angles can, in theory, reconstruct a three-dimensional picture of what's beneath the surface sonar, essentially for solid stone half a mile down. The team leaned hard on one specific point. They say 4 separate satellite systems, including Italy's Cosmo SkyMed and the commercial Capella space constellation, independently returned the same buried geometry in the same locations. One anomalous reading could be a glitch. 4 unrelated systems agreeing is a much harder thing to wave away. In a later phase, they also used AI models to help interpret the radar data rather than relying purely on human analysis, which the team framed as removing bias from the process, and which critics immediately flagged as introducing a black box that could just as easily manufacture patterns out of noise. That tension, did the machine find a structure? Or invent one, sits underneath everything else in this story. What they say those systems found breaks into 3 claims, and the first one sounds almost mundane until you hear the scale. The team reported 8 large vertical shafts, cylindrical, plunging straight downward beneath the pyramid, not angled tunnels, not collapsed passages, but 8 columns of open space arranged with what they describe as deliberate symmetry and appearing in relation to all 3 Giza pyramids, not just Khafre's, as though the whole plateau shared one buried system with the monuments above functioning as entry points. The standard cautious explanation for any void under a pyramid is natural karst limestone dissolves in groundwater over geological time, and Giza sits on a lot of limestone with a real water table underneath it. That's a completely legitimate baseline explanation. But natural cavities are messy. They follow whatever path water and weakness happen to take. They don't typically organize themselves into 8 matching vertical columns in a repeating pattern directly under a monument. And the detail that makes the shafts harder to dismiss as pure erosion, the team reported each one wrapped in a spiral pathway winding around its outside as it descends. Spirals aren't a typical signature of water erosion in limestone. The second claim goes deeper literally. According to the team, those 8 shafts descend more than 3,500 feet before opening into 2 enormous cube-shaped chambers, each reported at roughly 80 meters per side, large enough, if real, to be bigger inside than most modern sports stadiums, buried under half a kilometer of solid rock. Here's where the mainstream skepticism gets genuinely strong and worth taking seriously. Synthetic aperture radar is well established for reading the first few meters below a surface, and its reliability drops sharply the deeper you push it into dense rock. Claiming clean, sharp geometry thousands of feet down is exactly the kind of claim that pushes past what the technique is generally trusted to resolve. That's a real, legitimate technical objection, not just institutional gatekeeping. But set the depth argument aside for a second, and just look at the shape being claimed. A hollow cube with flat walls and right angles isn't something groundwater and geological time typically produce in limestone. If the reading is accurate, the shape argues for something built. If it's not accurate, the whole claim collapses. There's no comfortable in between. The third claim is the one that pulled this out of pure archaeology and into something stranger. Because it came from Biondi himself when he was asked directly what the buried structure was actually for. He didn't say tomb. He didn't say storage room. He described the structure as related to information and used a specific phrase that's since been repeated everywhere. He called the visible pyramids the tip of the iceberg, a lid placed over something, with the substance below. That framing connects to something that's actually been argued for close to 2 centuries by a fringe of engineers. Going back to figures like Nikola Tesla and continuing through modern writers like Christopher Dunn, the idea that the geometry, the granite-lined passages, and the precise alignment of these pyramids look less like tomb architecture and more like some kind of energy or resonance device. For 200 years, that argument had nothing underneath the floor to point to. If the 2025 scans are accurate, they hand that old argument a mechanism it never had before. It's also worth noting because it's genuinely part of the story, not just color, that this reframing echoes old Egyptian mythology about hidden halls beneath the sacred ground, tied to the god Thoth, and sometimes called the Hall of Records, long treated by historians purely as religious metaphor. The team's own spokesperson explicitly drew that connection. Whether that's meaningful or just pattern matching a myth onto a modern claim is exactly the kind of thing that can't be settled by a press conference either way. Now for the pushback, because it was immediate and it came from serious weight. Within days, Zahi Hawass, Egypt's former Minister of State for Antiquities and one of the most influential gatekeepers in the entire field, called the claims completely wrong, said they had no scientific basis. Stated the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities had never authorized this team to work in or around the second pyramid, and dismissed the radar method as unapproved and unvalidated. He used the phrase fake news without hedging. And some of his objections hold up under scrutiny. As of the claims going viral, there was no peer-reviewed paper. This was announced through a press conference and a media kit, not published research other scientists could independently examine and challenge. The depth resolution problem with SAR radar, which we already covered, is a legitimate technical concern raised by independent specialists, not just Hawass. And there's a real credibility question with the lead researcher. Corrado Malanga has a public history in UFO research and fringe theorizing, which understandably makes a cautious field even more skeptical. The team didn't help their own case when they also floated the idea that some of the buried structures could be as old as 38,000 years a date with zero excavated evidence behind it, and one that would upend the accepted timeline of human civilization if it were true. So does any of this prove there's an ancient machine sealed under the pyramids of Giza? No. Honestly, no. The most extreme version of this story, the buried power source, the lost engineering, the pre-dynastic megastructure, is not proven. It rests on a method that hasn't cleared peer review, applied at a depth where that method is at its weakest, from a team with a real credibility problem, with no excavation confirming a single chamber. But here's what gets lost in the fight between the two loudest sides. The cautious, fully mainstream version of Giza has, independently, also gotten genuinely strange over the last several years, and this part isn't disputed. In 2017, the peer-reviewed Scan Pyramids project used muon tomography, the same basic cosmic ray method Alvarez tried in 1968, just far more advanced, and confirmed a real large void above the Grand Gallery inside the Great Pyramid of Khafre, published in the journal Nature. In 2023, the same method confirmed a roughly 30-foot hidden corridor behind Khufu's north face, also peer-reviewed. Also real. In 2024, a separate team scanning the Western Cemetery beside the Great Pyramid identified an L-shaped anomaly buried a few feet down, sitting above a deeper, electrically resistive structure, and the lead researcher, a specialist in electromagnetic sensing, noted plainly that an L shape isn't something natural geology produces on its own. Excavation there is ongoing. And in April 2025, a joint German-Egyptian team using radar, ultrasound, and electrical resistivity confirmed two genuine air-filled voids behind the polished granite face of the Menkaure Pyramid. The smallest of the three, a finding that since passed peer review and carries a formal publication record. Strip the disputed Italian claims out completely, and Giza is still a plateau that keeps turning out to be more hollow than anyone expected. Scan after scan, year after year, confirmed voids, confirmed corridors, anomalies that specialists say don't form naturally. The only real argument left is how much more is down there, and who put it there. So here's where this actually stands, stripped of everyone's agenda. The Pyramid of Khafre is exactly where it's always been. The scans were taken, and the team stands behind them. The most prominent archaeologist in the field says they're worthless. No journal has weighed in either way. No excavation has been authorized, and under current Egyptian law which strictly limits destructive work on the plateau. For good reason, confirming anything thousands of feet down would require a national-scale project that hasn't been approved, and may not be for years. The shafts, the cubes, the buried structure, if it's there at all, sits exactly where it's sat for 45 centuries, unconfirmed, undug, and out of reach. And that's the part worth sitting with, not whether the answer is exciting, but that it's sitting right there, half a mile beneath the most visited monument on the planet. And almost nobody currently has permission to go check. If this changed how you look at those three triangles in the desert, there's another buried mystery waiting on screen right now, and it might change how you look at the ground everywhere else, too.